I'll get started with a brief intro. We are really excited and appreciative that all of you have joined us today, and especially to Dr. Classen and Monica Andrino. I will introduce our speakers and just welcome you. Thanks for joining the University of Arizona Museum of Art for this talk. And we always start out by recognizing as well that the University of Arizona is on the lands of land originally stewarded by indigenous peoples and the ancestral homelands of the Tana Atum and Yoeme or Pasquayaki people, and that Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes. Of course, when we think about iconoclasm, cultural theft, destruction of cultural objects, it's very relevant to think about that in relation to what has happened to indigenous peoples around the world. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk today. We are always excited when Dr. Albrecht Classen approaches us to suggest a topic that might be of interest to our audience, and we are equally excited when we get to spotlight student scholarship and student work. So today we are joined, I mentioned, by Dr. Albrecht Classen, who's a university distinguished professor in German studies. His research, many of his interests relate to writing and teaching around the history of German and European literature and culture, mainly 800 to 1800 time periods, but of course he's very in touch with contemporary issues as well, and always looking at those topics in relation to what is going on in the world today. He's been awarded for his teaching and his scholarship, and according to your profile, as of December 2023, you had published 127 books and 781 scholarly articles spanning poetry, translations into English from German, and of course, original research. So we are happy to welcome you back. And thank you for introducing us to Monica Andrino, who is our main speaker today, who is graduating this semester. Congratulations, in just a couple days, getting her degree in art history with a minor in German studies. So Monica and Dr. Classen have been working on an independent study related to the topic of iconoclasm this semester, and so we are looking forward to hearing about what they have been researching and writing about this semester. Just a quick reminder, I think we're all pretty good at Zoom now, but remember you can click view on the top right of your screen. If you don't need your video on, you can leave it off and it might create a smoother experience for everyone else. Feel free to put your questions in the chat if you would like, and we will have some time to have a little question and answer discussion at the end of this presentation. So I will turn the stage over to Dr. Classen to get us started.
All right, thank you very much. I think you can see this, right? Please confirm whether you can see my PowerPoint.
Not yet.
Okay, all good. Hold on a second. Oh, wait. I need to share. No. So no. Oh, you have to turn off your that's it. All right. So there we go. Okay, are we good? Thank you. So, hello everyone. I'm really delighted that so many of you, although it's a fairly small group, but considering the time of the year, so many of you have joined us. It is an absolute delight to give a presentation, although the limelight really will be Monica, not me. But it's really an incredibly rewarding experience to have almost a graduate student, a graduating student, doing research and in an independent study. Monica took a course with me on eroticism and love in the Middle Ages, I think about 2 years or 3 years ago, not 2 years, I think. And then eventually she approached me. I think you also did the course on history of religion with me, didn't you? Yes. And then she approached me and she wanted to do something that appeals to me very much as a medievalist. She is an art historian. I'm more in literary studies. And the topic was iconoclasm. And so we both had a wonderful fall semester. She bringing in all this individual research and me basically learning from her. And so I'm really excited that now this comes all to fruition. And I just want to give a couple of comments and make a couple of comments and address the larger issue so that I can set the stage for Monica. She is the expert now, and I'm just sort of on the sideline, a sidekick in a way. But at the same time, what I would like to do is, as a medievalist, set the stage a little bit and reflect upon the larger issues as they pertain both art history as well as history, economics, and religion. And as I just simply like to say, art history is never just aesthetics. It always tells us more about the background, reasons, conditions, concerns, and so forth. And so when we talk about iconoclasm, Monica will explain that more, but it's sort of an attempt to destroy images. And I want to talk about that a little bit, to the background of images. So my concern here is to reflect upon really the meaning of images, because we live, particularly today, maybe even more than ever before, in a world of images, and images are basically the battleground for a lot of different political, religious, and economic forces. So I have a quote here from Exodus in the Old Testament, where already at that time the whole idea was reflected upon. Quote, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." So already in the earliest times, at least in the Old Testament, the battle over images raged very much. And so I have a list here of 4 points. Pictures are the result of power struggles. In other words, those who produce or commission pictures or images or icons are in charge of power structures. Pictures thereby serve as a representation of those in charge in terms of money and power. But beyond that, of course, pictures represent for imagination. They represent also a lot of culture in general, mentality, and so forth. And they also very much represent who was in the dominant position. In other words, throughout history, pictures were produced for the dominant class. Right. So I have reflected quickly upon who is really in charge of pictures, who is entitled to produce these images, who commissions them. So that's the whole world of commissioners, the patrons, the art patrons. So what do pictures serve? They serve for propaganda. They represent religion. They play a huge role in politics, but in also aesthetics, but very much identity. I think Monica will address all those points in one way or the other, but I think here we have collected the major components that set the stage for the larger image or larger question: why were certain images created? Why were they destroyed? Or why did they become the bone of contention? And I think art history can never avoid being part of propaganda, religious debates, political struggles, and so forth, as much as they represent aesthetics, but because they provide a form or medium of identity they are the center of much attention of politics. As we say in English, of course, a picture is worth 1,000 words or 1,000 words. But at the same time, I would like us to warn us all that pictures are always easily subject to propaganda, manipulation, deception. They might reveal or hide images. So a very good critical reflection of any artwork, whether it's good or bad, allows us to understand much more behind this purely, let's say, the canvas or the sculpture. There's always another message. There is political messages, and whether artwork exists or not depends on the political structure, the economic power structure. So both in Christianity as well as in Islam, there have always been struggles over pictures. And I think those struggles have reflected the question, who is in charge? And Monica explored all kinds of different stages where images were introduced, banned, and so forth. So I don't need to go much into Christianity, but Islam, for example, is most famous for the avoidance, virtually the ban on images. Hence here a beautiful tile work in the cupola of the mosque of Isfahan in Persia, and you find it all over the world, including here in Tucson. When you go to any of the mosques you would not see images, but you see either text or geometric forms. So very clearly an indication what power or potential there is behind images. This is the one image, Monica, I wanted to show you, and I never could find it, but for this presentation, I finally could discover it again in my file. I took it when we were with my students in Utrecht, in modern-day Netherlands, and it is still in the cathedral or the major church there, and a perfect example of what iconoclasm mean. They have left it in this way because it is now identified as an historical object, artwork, and reflects the history of iconoclasm. So pictures have always been victims of protests. You might have heard that just yesterday there was a massive attack against painting I'm not quite sure, was it in the Met or was it in the Louvre? But somebody used color to destroy a major painting. Monica will address this a little bit further. That is a sculpture of the so-called Judensau, a very derogatory sculpture in the wall of the church of Wittenberg, where Martin Luther taught, and depicts here in a very mean and aggressive fashion the way of Jews who are sucking the teats of a sow or licking the anus. So, I mean, pork is forbidden for Jews. So this is the most demeaning image you can have. And Monica will give us more of the background, but there have been a lot of legal discussions today, even last year, and various courts have debated and discussed and then decided on whether that sculpture should stay there or not. And until it stays, it is identified as an historical object. There is, of course, a plaque explaining the strongly anti-Semitic sentiment expressed thereby. But despite all kinds of attempts by lay people to sue the church so that this could be removed, the courts have said, no, this is an historical object. So kind of iconoclasm has not affected this, but there are lots of attempts to remove this. So, and the next one is the question, who controls images? So Monica and I discussed and debated for a long time, is it acceptable to destroy images? And if they do not conform with our political, religious, or social views. Monica and I went through many different historical as well as contemporary issues. So I skip over this and I want to give you a German example. This is not an image, but the name of a street. And in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in Berlin, for example, there have been a lot of protests against racism. And so there is a subway station and a street called Mohrenstraße, so street, the Moor Street, which really ultimately pertains to the Saint Maurice, who was the first Black saint, actually the very first martyr in the history of Christianity. And there have been so many battles against this name. The city finally decided to replace the name Mohrenstraße with the Anton W. Amo Straße. Amo was a Black slave from Ghana in the 17th century, and he was given freedom by the regional duke and could then study at the University of Jena and Wittenberg, and became a professor of philosophy, and enjoys high respect today as a major Black professor. So this is sort of parallel to the iconoclasm. Other examples, very world famous, the Sphinx, for example. Lots of ancient sculptures have lost their noses. And this is the latest I just learned yesterday. This here is in Kiev. And I learned that many Ukrainian artists are suddenly worried that in the wake of the war, Russia against Ukraine, that there is the strong effort in Ukraine, according to a law from 2015, to remove all Russian or Soviet art. This is one of the examples. That is a so-called UFO from 1977. So it's an odd situation. The Ukrainian artists who did those things, probably for the Soviets, argue that they should be preserved for historical purposes. So you can see iconoclasm is a highly political issue, and it divides the public both directions. I just provide you very quickly a literary example, because that's my major area, but sort of losing the nose, iconoclastic attempt finds already examples in medieval literature, such as in Marie de France, her famous lay of Bisclave from about 1190. I'm missing an O. I probably committed iconoclasm myself. So iconoclasm then is a result of a fight over authority in religious, political, and social terms. Because as I said at the beginning, art is the product of commissions, it is being paid for, and it reflects new or old power structures. So in this regard, art has always been the victim of these public conflicts, and hence iconoclasm. And that is my range of things I wanted to reflect on. And I'm very proud of you, Monica, and I thank you very much for being with us and giving us your portion in this talk. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. And I will take it from here.
Yep.
Let me share my screen.
Yep.
And I will pick up where you left off. So this is my, title screen. This is iconoclasm throughout the centuries. I did collaborate with Professor Classen, and this is based off of a research portfolio that we constructed last fall. And I'm going to explore the ethics involved with determining, because there is both ethical and unethical iconoclastic events. It is often assumed that because it is iconoclastic, it is inherently tragic, which it definitely can be, but there's many nuances involved in determining that. So since this is a lot of information, I'm going to break this up into 6 different parts. I'm going to explain what iconoclasm is, its relevance, and the algorithm that I chose to explore these nuances involved. Then I'll use 2 historical examples, the Byzantines and the Protestants, 2 modern examples, the United States, the Southern United States and Kiev, Ukraine, and then the ongoing case of the Judenzow in Wittenberg, Germany. So first, I want to go over what exactly is iconoclasm. So it is a noun, the breaking or destroying of images, especially the destruction of images a picture is set up as objects of veneration. So it is often in a religious context, but that is not exclusive to iconoclasm. And some vocabulary that I'll be using is an iconoclast, which is a breaker of icons, a supporter of iconoclasm. So they are the perpetuators of it. And then an iconophile, which is a supporter of icons, typically religious and or monastic. And as Professor Classen said before, it can manifest itself in social, political, economic, or religious facets. It is not exclusive to only one category. It branches off into many different walks of life and, different parts of the cultural experience. And it is a manifestation of identity. The way we communicate ourselves, our beliefs, our values are often through icons and pictures, not even exclusively art as an aesthetic, but, propaganda or political imagery is a way that we commonly see that. And this is not a strictly academic concept. This is something that is permeated through everyday life, as we have seen before. You could pass by it every day unknowingly. It is very omnipresent in our life, whether it's very subtle or very grand. Let's see here. Nope. So why is it relevant? So you're exposed to it much more than you would often think. So an example that I found is the destruction of art for infrastructure's sake. Recently, a Chartist mural was destroyed by Newport Council in the south of Wales. It was a $100 million development, and they destroyed this beloved mural that had been in this city for a very long time. And at first glance, you wouldn't imagine that this is a grand iconoclastic event for the sake of a movement, but it is still one of the subtle ways that it can be in our lives today. And another form of that would be modern art as an act of intellectual or intentional iconoclasm. Banksy destroying his own works, Barnett, Newman, or Picasso deconstructing familiar icons because they are icons in a way to convey a specific artistic message. And this is not necessarily a good or bad form of iconoclasm, but it is something that is permeated and something that you can see anytime you walk into a museum. And it's important to understand how iconoclasm works and how to recognize it, because it's necessary to conserve and preserve history. And if we look back at the historic examples and the history that has been lost due to iconoclasm, it's difficult to study and research and look back on the past whenever so many artifacts have been lost. So in recognizing how it can manifest today, we can take the steps to work to preserve and conserve today's objects. For example, like in Kiev, Ukraine, keeping those Soviet buildings for the sake of further research and for history's sake. And recontextualization as a solution. It doesn't have to be, these things don't have to be destroyed. They don't have to be, completely exiled from the public eye. If they are reframed in an educational setting, it serves a different purpose. It's no longer an honorific of, say, a painful past, but it works to educate the public into what not to repeat or signs to look out for in the future. So I approach all of these topics with 4 key questions, because otherwise you get lost in the sea of nuance and all the different ways that it can be explored. So my first question that I use as a baseline is, was the object preserved? This typically is a good guide to see whether it is ethical or unethical iconoclasm, because often there is an opportunity for preservation, but sometimes that is, dismissed. But that is not always the foundational baseline. There are exceptions to that, but that is usually where I start from. And from there, I ask, was the destruction for the icon's meaning or for the icon's sake? Is it what the icon represents as an idea, or is it because it is a representation? Because it is a representation entirely. Often for icon's sake, that is in a religious context, leading back to the quote that from Exodus that Professor Classen provided, that icons in general could be seen as a negative. Then I ask, is the object within the iconoclast culture? Is it one culture dominating another culture, or is it the culture, the perpetuators of the culture destroying their own artifacts? And that's where things become more nuanced, a bit more blurry as to who is to say what you can and cannot do with your own artifacts. And then lastly, which connects to the first question, was the object recontextualized? Because you can preserve an object, but not necessarily recontextualize it in an educational setting. And that will be explored in one of our modern examples. So these are the 4 questions that I use to tether myself when deep diving into the many layers of these iconoclastic events. And it's important to look back on the historical before the modern and practice historical mindfulness, because we have to understand the foundation of how these iconoclastic events developed and how they kind of snowballed into an extreme event. And if we can recognize those processes, we can see how they can begin today. And like with Kiev, Ukraine, or other modern examples, if we can catch it early, we can see how it'll progress in the future. And iconoclasm has begun since the beginning of time. If we look at old Sumerian artifacts or Mesopotamian artifacts, dominance over other cultures is often through the destruction of venerated images, whether that is pagan idols or just images of daily life that they created. We find, shards of broken idols as evidence of past iconoclasm. So because it's been around as long as we have, it's important to recognize and understand that it is omnipresent in our lives. So I want to begin with the Byzantines, because that is often the event that is most associated with the term iconoclasm. And they provide a good amount of nuance in understanding how this whole process sort of works. So on the right is an iconoclastic cross that was implemented by Constantine V during his iconoclastic reign, which was around the 8th century. So what exactly was this event? So there were two iconoclastic periods during Byzantium, but the first is the most important and the most egregious in evidence. It began with Leo III and ended with Constantine V, his son, and that lasted from 717 to 775 in Byzantium, which is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. So it was under the guise of religious piety, but beneath that, it was a fight for empirical control. This a precursor to this event is theorized to be the Edict of Yazid, which is a edict proposed by the surrounding Islamic countries during a military skirmish between Byzantium and these neighboring countries, where this was kind of the beginning of the banning of depictions in Islamic culture, particularly the Prophet Muhammad depictions. And because of the military loss that Byzantium faced in the wake of these Muslim countries, Leo III kind of looked towards spiritual evidence as to why they suffered this loss. And he looked to the Edict of Yazid and looked to their success and felt that he needed to implement that himself in Byzantium for a spiritual success in a way. And that leads to the Edict of 730, which him and a council of bishops determined that no images that are not venerated by the church should be constructed, should be promoted. And the church decided that no images of Christ or of God truly depict the nature of Christ. It's either too much of his human nature, too much of his divine nature. It's never all encompassing. So the only allowed images would be the cross, the Eucharist, and images of the emperor, which plays into his own need for empirical control. And looking back towards all the way to the beginning of Constantinople with Constantine I, Eusebius was a close advisor to Constantine, and at the funeral of Constantine, he set a dictum that emperors are not above criticism, specifically in reference to their duty to lead Constantinople in a righteous path. And although this dictum was set much in the past, Leo III looked to this dictum and saw it as an opportunity for his empirical control to begin to slip whenever he is open to questioning. And because Constantinople was a theocracy, the most effective way to establish this authoritativeness and this control was through religious doctrine, thus the Edict of 730. So it was under this facade of religious piety and for the sake of religious, I don't know how else to say it, but underneath that, it was kind of an ego and control method of, ruling over Constantinople. His son, however, was less concerned with empirical control and had his own aggression and own disdain for the monastic order specifically. So whenever he took over from his father and began snowballing his own iconoclastic event, it was mainly focused on attacking monks and monastic orders. Two examples of this would be Saint Stephen the Younger and Euthysmius of Sardes, both of which were bound by their ankles, dragged through the streets of Constantinople for being outspoken iconophiles. So it was a very aggressive, very violent half of the iconoclastic event of 717 to 775, much more so than his father, Leo III. So circling back to those questions from before, were any of the objects preserved? No. Therefore, there was no room for recontextualization either. Did it take place within its own culture? Technically, yes. And that kind of is where things become more nuanced and a bit more muddy. Because they were the ones that created these images and created these icons, who are they to determine what is the fate of these icons? Is it not their duty to determine the fate of these icons and rule over them and decide whether they should be kept or destroyed? And they were destroyed for icons' sake, not for what they represented, but the fact that they were icons in general. So if they use scripture as evidence and as a justification for their destruction, who is to say that they are not within their right? However, whenever I was researching this event, I had determined that it was highly unethical due to the culture clash of the monastic order and specifically Constantine V. And because of the violence and it was almost serving as a proxy for his aggression. This blanket of religious piety was not the inherent goal. In reality, it was simply a mask to cover their own aggravations towards specific things, whether that's maintaining control or the monastic order. Because of that, I determined that this is a highly unethical event. So this carries on to the Protestant Reformation. There's a lot of parallels between the Byzantines and the Protestant Reformation with this guise of religious piety and underlying aggressions towards other orders. I specifically want to talk about the Beeldenstorm of Antwerp, Belgium in the 16th century. And in this image here, you can see an example of what happened during this time. So what was the event itself? It begins with the Protestant Reformation in 1517 in Germany. I believe most of us are familiar with Martin Luther and the 95 Theses. But Beeldenstorm specifically began in the Low Countries from 1566 to 1572. 10 days prior to this event in Belgium specifically was Steenvoorde, Flanders. It was Sebastian Matt, who was a Calvinist preacher who preached a sermon to a crowd which inspired them to destroy and desecrate a monastery of St. Lawrence. It was a mob, pitchforks, torches, and they had carried artifacts throughout the streets as a way of desecration. The Calvinists specifically were the culprits of the Beeldenstorm at the Ons Leef Cathedral. That's a long word for me to pronounce. On August 20th, 1566 in Antwerp, Belgium. The Calvinists were very concerned with the technical interpretation of the Bible, and they were not as keen on images as seen to the right with the why. They were visually anti-Catholic, and they interpreted icons at best to be irrelevant and distracting, and icons at worst to be the sin of idolatry. So the event was recorded by Sir Richard Clough, which was a Welsh merchant who happened to be there at the time. And how he recorded and described the event was they destroyed nearly all books, primarily books of hymns and other books that were honorifics to the saints, but not the Bibles. They defaced image of Our Lady and her chapel. The hands and faces of statues of saints were destroyed. However, Bible imagery was spared. So if a statue was holding a Bible or there's any sort of depiction of a Bible, because they held it so highly, those were always spared, but any evidence of traditionally Catholic imagery, such as the saints or of the Virgin, were desecrated. So circling back to those questions yet again, were any of the objects preserved? No, they went out of their way to be as demonstratively aggressive and demeaning of these objects. Therefore, there was no recontextualization either in this situation. And was it within the culture? At first glance, one would say yes. It is under the blanket of Christianity. They believe in the Trinity, the resurrection of Christ, so you would assume that it would be within one culture. However, in reality, although they're both Christian, Catholic and Protestant belief systems are so vastly different. And because it was inherently so anti-Catholic and anti-Catholic culture, it is two entirely separate branches that one is attempting to dominate the other. So in that sense, it is completely outside of the culture, and it is a culture opposing event. And because of this, it is the conclusion I came to with my research that this is a highly unethical event due to, yet again, the aggression in which it occurred but also it was an act of attempting to dominate another culture, which is inherently a uneven power dynamic. Although the Catholics were the authority at the time in Europe and Protestants were not even allowed to worship at this point, it was a very violent approach, and many people were killed or injured during this process. So it was an inherently unethical event. So looking back at these historical examples and the aftermath of these, it helps us determine iconoclastic motives and the understanding of the process, the thinking process of how this works. Often it is religious justifications, at least in these specific examples. And oftentimes we cannot judge based on the context, or we cannot judge based on the given justifications. We often have to look at the outer context and the historical context to lead us to the conclusion of why this actually happened. For example, with the Byzantines, Leo III and Constantine V and the Protestants all claimed religious piety as the justification for these iconoclastic events, that they are doing this in the name of God. However, Leo III, in reality, he just was striving to maintain his authority and empirical control. Constantine V was using this as an outlet for his anti-monasticism, and the Protestants were using this as an outlet to dominate the Catholic culture and completely eradicate evidence and any reverence of the Catholics. So this was not under the guise of true religious piety and the desire to really follow in the footsteps of the Bible or in the footsteps of God. Those were irrelevant to the greater context, and these were really very human desires and angers that they were using iconoclasm as an outlet to continue. So we have now gone over the historical examples to help, lay a foundation and construct a proper analysis. But we do need to look to modern examples to see how it kind of manifests itself today. And we now have tools, as seen with many, many historical examples. Those are only a few. And each example comes with its own nuance and new added layers that provide us more information on how to recognize these future events. So once we understand how they develop and how they escalate, we can see how we can prevent it in the future. And I provided both a local and a foreign example because both are very necessary, because iconoclasm presents itself completely determined by the cultural environment. What are the social norms at the time? What are the cultural norms, the religious norms? What is the dominant religion of the location? All of these play very vital parts in how the iconoclastic event develops and kind of snowballs into something more extreme. So I want to begin with the Southern United States, specifically the Confederate obelisk in Birmingham, Alabama. This is a local example, which I imagine not specifically this obelisk, but the conflict of Confederate honorifics is a very, pertinent example that I'm sure many of us have heard before. So this, I believe, is a good starting point for a modern example. So specifically, the removal of the Confederate obelisk in Birmingham, Alabama. The obelisk itself was built in 1905. Its official name is the Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It's 52 feet tall, made of sandstone, engraved with the words from Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederates. The manner of their death was the crown and glory of their lives. This obelisk has since been removed in the summer of 2020 amid the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, the death of George Floyd. There was a lot of chaos and tension, specifically in the South, which led to the removal of this statue. But of course, this was not met without much resistance. And there were two main arguments provided. The first of which is it's meant to honor the soldiers and honor the deaths of those who fought for their country. However, this objectively is incorrect. So the city did not exist until a decade after the war ended. And the obelisk itself was constructed during the height of the Jim Crow era and the height of the Ku Klux Klan. And when presenting and unveiling this obelisk, the keynote speaker, George P. Harrison, who was the United Confederate Veterans Commander-in-Chief, he specifically states he wants to thank the fallen soldiers for their protection from, and I quote, the hideous specter of threatened race equality. It is pretty undeniable that the origins of this obelisk is inherently racist and inherently hateful. That is undeniable. And another argument is that the majority wanted to keep it. This was a beloved monument by Birmingham, and it would be unfair to remove this because the people, this is part of their culture. However, 70% of Birmingham is African American and did vote for the approval of its removal. However, most of the resistance legally was from state politicians who were 77% white, and they claimed that the majority did not want its removal, which again is incorrect. So going back to these questions yet again, was the object preserved? It was. The mayor explicitly protected the statue from destruction, and it was adopted by the Daughters of the Confederation. So this was sort of recontextualized. It is now in an educational setting, but it is still celebrated and is still held as an honorific, but is no longer in the public eye as a honorific. And it does take place within the culture. It is an American obelisk fought for by Americans, resisted and agreed upon by Americans. This is in a bubble of the kind of Southern mentality. And it was removed for the icon's meaning, not for icon's sake. It is a painful memory of slavery, the Confederacy, and Jim Crow. Many of like the 70% of African-American voters that voted for its removal did claim that walking by it every day to work or to school always was a pressing reminder of a very painful past. And that was why they fought so hard for its removal. So was this an unethical iconoclasm? In my research, I concluded that no, it is not unethical. The baseline for that is that the object was preserved. It would be unethical if it was completely eviscerated and destroyed. And I don't believe that it's right in any context to destroy historical artifacts, whether they are positive or negative. But because this was adopted by the Daughters of the Confederation and it will be preserved for foreseeably a long time, and it will continue to be studied and researched and looked back on Confederate history, it is a sort of win-win scenario. The general public is now more comfortable in their homes, not having this looming reminder of the past, but at the same time, history is still preserved. And that brings me to a foreign example, which is the icons in Kiev, Ukraine, specifically the removal of Soviet imagery from their national monument, which you can see in this photo here. So a foreign example is, helps us get a more well-rounded view, and it offers more interesting nuance that may not be here at home for us that the local example would have. Specifically right now, the geopolitical context and the Russian-Ukrainian tensions that have a long-standing history, which play a very large part in the removal of these icons. So what is the event itself? It's the removal of the hammer and sickle off the shield of Mother Ukraine, which was formerly known as the Mother of the Fatherland during the communist era. The symbol itself, it was built May 9th in 1981, which was shortly before the dissolving of the Union. It is the hammer and sickle, obviously the very recognizable symbol of communism, and then it was promptly removed August 6, 2023. So this was very, very recent of an event, and as Professor Classen showed us earlier, there are still ongoing works for decommunization here. So the laws were introduced in April 2015, which is, in legal writing, the act of removing Soviet imagery. However, the process of decommunization began in 1991. So once the Union dissolved, they were very quick to move all of those reminders out of public sight. The Eastern Bloc countries also began this process around the same time. Ukraine was under Russian rule for over 100 years. Ukraine was communist alongside them until the dissolving of the Union. So there is a very long-standing, deep woven connection between the two countries. And whenever the Russian invasion occurred in February 2022, that added even more more aggression to the underlying tension that was already present. Ukraine is not acknowledged as a sovereign nation by Vladimir Putin. He has explicitly said this, and that further drives this desire to decommunization, and because decommunization is in turn removing any Russian imagery. Although Russia is no longer communist, it still is kind of a side-by-side parallel interpretation for Ukrainians. So of course, this was met with resistance similarly to the obelisk, but it's not the same sense of resistance where it's more of an emotional resistance. This is, as we have brought up before, an economic factor. So the process started during the war, and it was not cheap. It was very expensive. It was 28 million hryvnias, which is the equivalent to 758,000 US dollars, which to us may not sound like a lot, but in the middle of wartime, that money could definitely be spent elsewhere, which is exactly what President Zelensky says in this quote. Museums, cultural centers, symbols, TV series, all this is important, but now we have other priorities. Find non-budgetary funds, the state must focus its maximum attention on defense needs. The cultural minister, Alexander Tkachenko, did claim that all of the funds were from sponsors. However, due to this project, he was forced to resign by President Zelensky. So this kind of introduces a very interesting nuance where the emotional and social sense is in favor of the removal, as is the 85% of the population being in favor. However, it was the economic factor that brought up this resistance and this desire to keep it, not because they want it, but because it's not a priority at this point. There was a bit of emotional pushback by the older generation, specifically on the outskirts of the country, closer to the Russian border, because Russia and Ukraine have such an overlap and it starts to blur for so many decades. A lot of the older generation grew up speaking Russian, learning Russian culture, being kind of divided or torn between Russian and Ukrainian identity. It is much harder for them to let go of that part of history. This could be similar to the older generation of Southerners that do still feel that connection to the Confederacy, although it is a much different dynamic between cultures. That older generation still kind of holds on to the past in that way as a sense of comfort and familiarity. So returning to those questions, was the object preserved? Yes, it is moved to the National Museum of History of Ukraine in the Second World War. So it's now in an educational setting, and it is completely recontextualized from an honorific reminding of, Russian rule to now a still painful reminder of the communist past, but, the honorifics have been stripped. And it has since been replaced by the Ukrainian coat of arms, the trizub, which is the trident, which we've all, I'm sure, have seen. And it is from outside of the culture. The Soviet culture is what they are currently trying to shed, because that is not something that they identify with anymore. And because it is a painful reminder that they are trying to remove from everyday vision, from, walking the streets, there's this giant, enormous statue that dons this, hateful symbol, this unhappy symbol. So this is from an outer culture, but not in a sense of dominating another culture, but simply trying to shed a past version of themselves. And it was removed for the icon's meaning, not for icon's sake. It is a lingering reminder of communism. Of course, the hammer and sickle was a blatant reminder. And it has been, of course, as mentioned before, recontextualized. So as a whole, I would consider this a ethical iconoclasm, yet again, because of the preservation and the essence of trying to move forward from a negative past. And with the current dynamic between Russia and Ukraine with the ongoing war, it's completely fair to assume that it's fair to anticipate that they would want to shed that painful past, and they wouldn't want to hold on to that whenever they were actively being invaded and, oppressed by that same country, that same force. So going back to these questions yet again, and why they are so important when addressing these 4 examples so far. They are, the method for guidance, because there's so much between the economic, we can look at the racial dynamics of the South, we can look at the current geopolitical situation of Kiev, but then you can get lost in this sea of nuance and different ways of interpreting this whole event and the different perspectives and rabbit holes you can go down. So these questions serve as a tether. And because they tether you to a foundation, it does allow you for room for further investigation in specific points, because you will always have a solid rock to go back to. And it helps you better understand the implications of all these events. If you ask these specific questions and you dissect the justifications and the meaning and the reasoning behind it and why they did what they did, it helps you understand iconoclastic events moving forward. And this brings us to the example brought up by Professor Classen, which I want to dive into, which is current day Germany, the legal battle against the Judensau. And just again, looking over this, there's the female pig, the rabbi, the Jews, and the inscription on the back. So I want to show you an example today showing how we handle iconoclastic events as in, in this very moment, because this is an ongoing legal battle. And we can see how past examples and more recent examples kind of blend together into how we deal with that today. So the symbol itself is, as explained before, the rabbi licking the anus and suckling the teat of a female pig. This symbol first appeared in the 13th and 14th centuries. The church was built in 1489 to 1509, but we don't know if the carving was at the inception of the church, if it was an addition later. And it is on a very high point of the church, but it is on the facade, so it is very visible, and it was intended to be seen by visitors. And as said before, pigs are viewed as an unclean animal in the Jewish faith, so this makes this incredibly hostile and incredibly demeaning intentionally. So as for the lawsuits, protests against the Judenstau began in 2017, which marked the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And it began with Michael Duhlmann, who sued the church in 2018, so only a year after, which was very short. His quote is, "This is a church, a holy place. You can't mix it with such a shameful assault on the Jews." He's an active member of the Jewish community in Berlin, and he proposed this lawsuit to the District Court of Dessau, who then denied the claim a year later in 2019. But he appealed, and is currently at a standstill at the Higher Regional Court of Nuremberg. And of course, we ask, why is he suing the church for the statue? And the reason is obvious. It is incredibly anti-Semitic. So this is the church where Luther put his 95 Theses, and although it might not be common knowledge, Martin Luther was incredibly anti-Semitic. He released a treatise in 1543 of the unknowable name of the generations of Christ, which the cover has a Judenstau motif on it. So he is very aware of this motif, and he actually, in this treatise, goes into detail as to why it is fitting for Jewish people. And I quote, "His rabbinic colleagues were looking for the name of God in the most profane of places." So this is not an isolated image, but this directly ties to the teachings within the church, why the church is important inherently due to 95 Thesis by Martin Luther. It all ties together, which makes it incredibly difficult to separate the two when it comes to removing the icon overall. And of course, this was met with resistance and promotion on either side. The Wittenberg town pastor argues that it should stay, it's part of the church. And one of the judges in this trial, Judge Volker Buchlock, argues that it was recontextualized, as mentioned before by Professor Classen. There is a Shoah memorial placed right underneath the carving, which Judge Volker claims neutralizes the meaning. So it essentially cancels each other out. There's one very anti-Semitic image, one very, very honorific of the Shoah and of Jewish faith underneath it, so it should cancel each other out. In my own personal opinion, I don't think it works that way, but regardless. German Jewish historian Michael Wolfson argues that hiding the motif is hiding the truth. Hiding the statue is hiding shame. We must face it and address it. And it could be perceived as whitewashing Luther and trying to sweep his dark history under the rug for the sake of saving face. But some of the arguments against the resistance would be from Region Bishop Friedrich Kramer, who agrees with Duhlmann that it should be removed. The federal anti-Semitism commissioner Felix Klein claims it belongs in a museum. There is a Luther House museum in Wittenberg for specifically artifacts regarding Luther. There is no reason for it to remain on the church when it could be rehoused and recontextualized in a museum setting. And of course, the local Jewish community is backing Duhlmann in this lawsuit because obvious reasons. And the Berlin Jewish Community's commissioner on anti-Semitism, Sigmund Königsberg, states, "What you see of anti-Semitism today is the old anti-Judaism, but wrapped in modern form." And this leads to the current risk of keeping this motif. Although it's not a direct, at least at face value, not a direct insinuation of these things and of violence, it does play a part in the grander context of anti-Semitism in contemporary Germany. There was a rise of anti-Semitic hate crimes in Germany during this time. There's the increased popularity of the AfD, which is a very conservative right-wing branch of German politics, which some claim has been directly tied to anti-Semitism. There was the attack on the Halle Synagogue on October 2019 during Yom Kippur, which is the year that the lawsuit was denied in court. And between 2017 and 2018, there has been a 20% increase in hate speech and hate crimes towards Jewish faith in Germany. So with this, this looming sense of violence and aggression towards Jewish people, this motif at the very front of such an important and famous church, of course, is met with the desire to perform an iconoclasm against it, in the sense where they want to remove this icon and recontextualize it into a different setting. So it's not viewed as, it's not necessarily an honorific, but it is such a direct tie to the church itself. And it is making, for many people, worship and feeling safe in this church impossible when such a hateful image is so pertinent on the face of it. And this returns us to the questions one last time. Would the object be preserved? It would. It would be relocated to the Luther House Museum, therefore recontextualized in an educational setting. Is the object within the culture? It is part of German history, German Jewish history specifically, and German Jews are the ones that are fighting so hard against it. So it is not a dominance of another culture or the shedding of a past culture. Inherently, they recognize that this is part of themselves, which leads to the arguments of why they want to keep it and why they want to remove it, because they all recognize it as part of themselves. And is it for the icon's meaning or for icon's sake? It is, of course, for the anti-Semitic meaning, because it does start to parallel modern anti-Semitism. And it is viewed as dangerous. It is intellectually dangerous to have a promotion of a hateful stereotype, a hateful perception of the Jewish faith on such a widely celebrated monument. So to conclude all of this, iconoclasm as a practice is woven throughout history into our contemporary societies. The iconoclastic is unavoidable. While omnipresent, it is not inherently a tragic event. As seen previously, it can mark positive change and new beginnings. Specifically with the Judenschau, I want to say that it, although very nuanced and very complicated, it does mark a very significant change with current political happenings right now, current geopolitical happenings. Addressing anti-Semitism, specifically in motifs such as this, is very important in marking positive change. Understanding the complexities and functions of this practice is vital to the cultural growth and the protection of expression, religiously, socially, and politically. So in understanding iconoclasm through an art historical lens, through an ethical lens, there's a lot of factors to be considered, but through my kind of algorithm of approaching this with these 4 questions and dissecting the justifications, the consequences, the reasonings behind all of this, it's very important for the sake of freedom of expression to not allow people to dominate over what you can and cannot depict, what you can and cannot say, but at the same time, protecting social comfortability, feeling safe in your own environment, and not maintaining negative and hateful symbols for the sake of preserving symbols overall. And that concludes my presentation.
Very good, Monica. Thank you.
And if there's any questions, I am more than happy to answer.
Thanks so much to both of you, and thank you, Monica. That was such an instructive and well-organized talk. That was really easy to grasp. Those 4 questions for such a helpful lens on all these really nuanced and sometimes very difficult to kind of understand, or complex at least, situations. Yes, a lot of thank yous and compliments in the chat. And if you came in late, we were recording and we will hope to have this up on YouTube soon, but drop a question in the chat if you have it. I was just kind of curious what inspired you both to look at this topic as part of your study.
I'm trying to remember specifically the conversation me and Professor Classen had, which led to iconoclasm. I believe it was during his history of religion class that we had reached a topic of the destruction of images in regards to faith and religion. And I think for me personally, that it was such a complicated question and such a complicated concept with so much room for exploration that that's what drew me to the topic myself.
I would like to add that I simply consider this whole issue highly difficult, problematic, relevant. I don't think that either Monica or I have taken a very specific position. You can really see it this way or that way. I think what really matters for us is to become more sensitive. In other words, to understand that images, sculptures, whatever, have political messages, for example, or religious or whatever. So I'm not taking any position with let's say, the sculptures of southern states generals or so in Virginia, for example. That's it's a political decision. It is the question, I think, how a community wants to approach its own past, and that is, well, I think that is a political decision. We as art historians, if I may call myself that, Monica is much more than me, but we as art historians have a responsibility to consider these things, reflect upon them, and provide then the readers, those who listen to us, colleagues and the lay people, the audience, with at least the examples so that each person can make his or her own decision. And as Monica has outlined so beautifully, iconoclasm has been with us. Whenever there is a picture, then there is a potential for conflict. And I think the academic approach to iconoclasm suggests strongly that we can learn for that and become more informed. What the ultimate outcome will be is very hard to say. I think in Germany, they take a different approach to their own past compared to the United States. Germany went through a horrible history of anti-Semitism, Holocaust, and so forth. But you have, I think, more memorials and sculptures or plaques and other objects that are reminding us of that past than in any other country in the world. So this is very interesting. I mean, I would never expect in our country to see as many documents dedicated, let's say, to the crimes the white colonialists have done to the indigenous population. There's some few attempts, but we are far apart from the approach Germans are using. So that's a political issue, and I think it's an extremely important issue, and it suddenly shows us the relevance of those art historical approaches. That is not just simply aesthetically pleasing, but rather it's a critical scholarly approach. And that's what Monica and I sort of hope to bring out in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your work with us. Someone asks, are you planning to publish this material or share it otherwise, and encourages you to do so?
I would love to publish this. My grand research portfolio, I am still currently working on. It's very extensive. I've hit about 40 pages at this point, and I'm still missing a chapter or two. But whenever I do, now that I am graduated and I can dedicate more time to working on this, and I definitely plan to continue my research, specifically in the art historical sphere, I would love to explore publishing this work. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good luck, and I will help you.
Yeah, I appreciate from like an art, in the context of an art history talk, I felt like it was very clearly presented and it made me feel like you were ready to go into teaching, Monica.
Or as a curator, or something that you would like to do in the world of art history.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
Monica, any plans after graduation?
Still trying to figure it out, but I would love to remain in academia if I could, or in just the general research or the arts or history in any sort of those different branches. That would be ideal, because I do feel very passionately about all of these things, and iconoclasm specifically, because I've dedicated so much time to research and to writing and to talking about it. I've had so many conversations about it with my peers and getting them interested in the topic. And I've now, because I've become so knowledgeable, I see it and I recognize it in places I wouldn't otherwise. So I would love to continue to explore this in a career path, if the opportunity does present itself.
Well, yeah, I agree with Dr. Classen here. Ready for grad school if that's a path you're going down.
Ideally, yes.
Thank you both again. We will, I think, wrap up for today. But again, thanks to everyone for being here. And wishing everyone a wonderful week and a happy celebration of all your accomplishments this week, Monica, and happy end of the semester. We will see you all again at the museum or online sometime soon, I hope.
Yeah, and well, thank you very, very much for giving us that opportunity. You know, as I said, I'm very proud of Monica, and I'm really happy that she could shine and profile her work so well, thanks to you. And it's really wonderful to have this exchange and to give back and forth. So, I mean, your museum is a pearl, it's a treasure of extraordinary quality. And so if we can contribute just a little bit, this is a great honor for us as well. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you so much for the opportunity as well. I very much appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Our pleasure as well.
All right.
Again,
Thank you very much. Take care.
take care, everyone.
Thank you.